Hello and welcome to the CDSC Cybersecurity webinar. My name is Renee Hartsfield. I'm a cybersecurity instructor and course manager here at CDSC and your host for today's webinar. Today I will be discussing some vulnerabilities that are associated with privileged accounts and some best practices in securing those accounts. I am so happy that you could join me today as I will be asking for audience participation by way of some poll questions. And if time allows, I will be answering questions that are asked during the webinar and also questions that were sent in earlier. If for some reason I am unable to answer your questions during this session, I will make sure that I get you an answer. Either way, I will ensure that you receive a response. But before I get into today's topic, I'm going to briefly turn things over to Tina, who's an instructional designer here at CDSC, and she's going to walk you through the ground rules for today's webinar and also provide you with some instructions on how to use the tools you would need to participate. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Renee. So if you take a look in the top right-hand corner, there's an icon with 4 arrows. It is used to enlarge the presentation for full view. However, when poll questions appear, reselect the icon to allow you the ability to answer the questions. Next, we have in the bottom left-hand corner notes and announcements for this webinar, for today's webinar. We provide closed captioning, displays text of today's audio. There's a question and answer box to your right. You're invited to enter questions throughout the presentation. Renee will address questions at the end if time permits. In the bottom right, there's file share box. The presentation has been loaded. You can download at any time. The last thing is poll questions. Please remember to reselect the icon if you're in full screen to allow you to participate to answer the poll question. Back to you, Renee.
Thank you, Tina. So again, for today, I will be discussing some vulnerabilities that are associated with privileged accounts and some best practices in managing those accounts. I will start by defining a privileged account. I will then identify some common types of privileged accounts, some vulnerabilities associated with those accounts, and lastly, discuss some best practices in protecting those accounts. These are best practices, and although some are driven by DoD regulation, please keep in mind that your organizational rules and regulations will dictate which practices you will be held accountable to follow. So, what are privileged accounts and users? Well, the Committee on National Security Systems Glossary, the CNSS 4009, that's dated on April 6, 2015, defines a privileged account as an information system account with approved authorizations of a privileged user. And it also defines a privileged user as a user that is authorized and therefore trusted to perform security-related functions that ordinary users are not authorized to perform. It further outlines their responsibilities as those that are vested in them according to DoD's cybersecurity policies and procedures. Again, keep in mind your organization's policy will be the driving force behind the practices that are implemented and enforced in your organization. Although most of the best practices that are discussed in today's webinar are DoD policy, this webinar is not intended to dictate DoD's policy on you. It is only a discussion of those best practices. However, DoD has implemented certain policies that govern their cybersecurity workforce. They have mandated that those individuals that are responsible for managing DoD network, those privileged users, be thoroughly trained and qualified to perform those functions. They have broken down their IA workforce into categories and specialties as shown on the screen. And within those categories, they have further broken down into technical and management. Both their IA technical and management workforce categories each have 3 levels. Personnel that are required to perform any IA function at any level within those categories must be certified to the highest level function performed. The chart that is shown on the screen now reflects certifications that DoD recognizes as those certifications that qualifies an individual to perform in positions requiring privileged access. This is not just a best practice for DoD, it is a policy. Furthermore, if your organization is not mandated in standard, they would be wise to do so. Best practice indicates an absolute must to mandate that your personnel are indeed qualified to have privileged access on your network. Just consider this. Would you really want someone that is unskilled having such unrestricted access on your network? What is important to understand and remember is that not all security incidents that occur are due to malicious intent. The untrained inside privileged user poses just as big a threat, if not more. Let's take a look at this poll question. Do you believe that privileged users pose a threat in your organization? It will be interesting to see the results. The numbers are coming in. Just to give you a little insight as to why I posed this question, I recently read an article, and in that article, a study had been conducted in which the same question was asked. There were 818 information technology decision makers surveyed, which 408 of them were in the United States. Of those 408 that were in the U.S., 59%, that's over half, roughly 241, believed that privileged users posed the biggest threat to their organization. So I'm looking at the numbers now, and considering the numbers from that study and looking at the numbers that are coming in from you all today, I think it's pretty safe to say that the majority of us understands and agrees that privileged accounts and users are also powerful. Let's face it, privileged accounts and users hold the keys to your entire network, and they pose a serious risk. Why? Because they are unlimited by fewer controls than the non-privileged user. They also have a wider array of access to your network, and because of this, they are able to cause more damage as they often go undetected for longer periods of time. I put together some headlines from cyber attacks that were in the news. These are attacks that were facilitated through their access to privileged accounts. Let's take a look at them. First, the database administrator steals 2.3 million records at Fidelity National subsidiary. How about Medco's system administrator gets 30 months for planning logic bombs? And let's not forget the infamous Edward Snowden leaks thousands of NSA documents. In the case of Edward Snowden, it was reported that he may have persuaded more than 20 fellow workers at the NSA Regional Operations Center in Hawaii to give him their logon and passwords. And in addition, he was actually able to get other system administrators to actually give him their password. Can you believe that? What about rogue DBA steals and sells personal info and San Francisco IT worker arrested and hijacking the city network? And he actually took control of the network and locked all of the other administrators out. Lastly, just last month, the big security breach of the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. This attack went undetected for nearly a year. And again, according to published reports, the attackers gained administrative privileges into this agency's systems. You know, I was reading an OPM latest news webpage, and the question was asked, what has OPM done to shore up its systems? Among several of their answers were that additional upgrades included restricting remote access for network administrators and restricting network administration functions remotely were being implemented. Folks, these are best practices. Not to say that they were not already implementing those security features that they deem were necessary, but we have got to better protect these accounts or else we will forever be faced with these types of breaches. We're probably never going to be able to completely wipe out every risk there is, but we can make it oh so very difficult. And we do that by implementing those best practices that are tried and true. Let's take a look at some common attacks with elevated privileges. There is a system administrator account that's used to administer the system, like installing hardware and software, creating user accounts, and troubleshooting system problems. There's also web administrator accounts that are used to maintain the web applications and services, and the network administrator account that is utilized in maintaining the network infrastructure, such as the routers, the hubs, the switches. Also, there are system accounts and service accounts. Not all privileged accounts are user accounts. Applications and computer services also use privileged credentials. Often the passwords are hard-coded into the application. So, in addition to those privileged accounts that are used by privileged users, there are also privileged accounts that are used by applications to connect to other applications. For example, the front-end web application connecting to a database. System accounts are used by the operating system and by services that run on the Windows. And by default, those accounts have same functional privileges as the administrator account. Additionally, service accounts that run a Windows service are most often granted elevated privileges. This could be a local group such as local administrators or a domain group such as a domain administrator's account. Due to this high-level privilege, we need to ensure that these accounts are protected in case of an attack against them. Speaking of service accounts, a service that runs in the context of the local system account inherits the security context of the Service Control Manager, or SCM. The SCM is a component of Windows that manages services and is started at system boot. It provides an interface and performs tasks for the services when they are started. Most of the services don't need the elevated privileges that they have. If the service does not need these privileges and is not an interactive service, consider using local service or network service. Both are predefined local accounts used by the SCM, and they both have minimal privileges on the local computer. Let's take a look at another poll question. At a minimum, how often should privileged account passwords be changed? Should it be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Okay, the numbers are coming in. I see some for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Good, good. Okay, I see most of you all, the majority of you all have it exactly right, 60 days. Well, industry best practice indicates that passwords should be changed at a minimum every 60 days. DoD also mandates 60 days. Of course, there are instances that will dictate that a change is needed sooner. If someone that has a privileged account leaves the organization for whatever reason, the passwords needs to be changed immediately. Same thing would apply if their position changed or they no longer needed those elevated privileges to perform their new duties. An example is when someone is being administratively removed. At the same time, that person's access should be removed also. There should be no lag time. Another best practice, and again, DoD policy, deals with password composition. Passwords should be at least 14 characters in length and contain a combination of upper and lowercase letters, along with numbers and special characters. Often, to simplify things, system administrators will use the same password across multiple systems and among multiple administrators. This is a huge risk. If a hacker or someone wanting to cause malicious damage can get a hold of this common and shared password, they will have gained access to your entire network. Whereas this may be convenient, it is all too risky and ill-advised. Industry best practice indicates that passwords for privileged accounts should never be shared. This will decrease the risk of the password getting into the hands of the wrong person and also provide accountability for security, auditing, and compliance purposes. What's really interesting is another article that I read, and it stated that 51% of organizations that were surveyed stated that privileged and administrative account passwords were shared among approved users. Can't remember the exact number of organizations that were represented, but I know it was over 200, which makes it at least 100 of those organizations could possibly be putting their organization's vital information at risk. I don't know about you, but that's alarming to me, especially if any of those 100 organizations are holding some of my personal information. It is a best practice that a privileged account should never be used while performing your everyday job. Each person who administers the system should, in addition to their privileged account, also have an ordinary user account. Instead, using a non-privileged account offers the added protection against such things as malware, security attacks, and other accidental or intentional mishaps from possibly affecting the entire network through these accounts. A best practice is to use your everyday account to check and read your emails, while only using your privileged account to perform only those duties that require elevated privileges. A privileged user who clicks inside of, say, a potentially infected email might unknowingly be giving a hacker elevated rights into the network. There's just a greater chance of malware infecting the entire network and causing more damage if it enters through a machine with full administrative privileges. You should also develop and enforce a policy of least privilege. Grant privileged users only those privileges that are necessary to perform their official duty. There is always a risk that privileges will be abused. The goal is to reduce risk by limiting the number of people with access to those critical system security controls, such as the ability to enable or disable various system security features, or even change privileges of users or programs. Best practices suggest that it is better to have several administrators with limited access than to have one administrator that has access to everything. Enforcing separation of duty places a barrier that may prevent one individual from perpetrating a fraud. By dividing the roles and responsibilities, you decrease the ability of one person to subvert critical processes. For instance, it would not be a great idea to have your system developers have admin privileges on your live systems. That is, those systems that are currently being used every day. There would be no checks and balances as to whether a half-developed system that has not passed testing in a testing environment actually being placed on the live network. By applying these best practices, you can limit the damage resulting from accidents, sabotage, or unauthorized access or use of the system resources. At a minimum, an administrator password on a test system should not work in the live environment. Database administrators, or DBAs, should only have DBA authority, not administrative privileges on the system. Auditing and monitoring your network is also very important, and knowing what your privileged users are doing on your network is even more important. Privileged users require privileged access in order to perform their daily duties. However, these privileges have known to be misused in order to gain unauthorized access to sensitive information. It is known to cause damage to systems and networks, and even to hide their own trails. To deter this from happening, organizations should proactively audit and monitor all privileged activity. An audit log provides a trail of evidence in case of a compromise. This can help identify and analyze those compromises that may have occurred, as well as detecting accounts and signs of suspicious and unexpected behavior. A best practice is to audit sensitive privilege. Sensitive privilege use, it records events related to use of sensitive privileges, such as those that are listed on the screen. And again, success audit records successful attempts, and failure audits records unsuccessful attempts. Organizations need to protect themselves from privileged user threats. Implementing best practices and flexible policy-based solutions can ensure visibility into those activities of the privileged users. Develop a policy that defines how privileged accounts will be managed. A layered strategy that's comprehensive and implements best practices. It does not have to be complicated, and it should be flexible. It should provide irrefutable attribution. Sometimes just knowing that your actions are being monitored serves as a deterrent. To sum it all up, all organizations have to balance the security risks associated with privileged accounts against the operational efficiencies gained through the use of these accounts. This webinar outlines some general best practices and vulnerabilities associated with privileged accounts. We know that information technology and systems are an integral part to our operations, but we must stay vigilant in countering the threats that target these systems. So often these threats are targeted towards and facilitated through the use of privileged accounts, and whereas these accounts are an absolute must to operate and maintain our networks, they are, nevertheless, a big target for the attacker. These same accounts can pose your biggest threat. As I mentioned previously, obtaining privileged access is like gaining the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. So the bottom line, do not be the insider threat either willingly or unwittingly. Well, thanks again for everyone's awesome participation. While that was an excellent overview on best practices for privileged users and accounts, I want to also point out that if any of our listeners would like to get a more in-depth look into any of CDSE's other cybersecurity education and training, check out our Center for the Development of Security Excellence, Security, Education, Training, and Professionalization for DoD and industry website at http://www.cdse.edu. Let's look at some of the questions that came in during the webinar. Okay, one question was asked, I am a 0080. How does this apply to me as a security manager? Okay, as a 0080, okay, supporting a DoD network, a lot of this is mandated. However, I would say that it is important that the security administrator understands that what the best practices are and how they relate to network security, and working together with the ISSM and other system and network personnel in providing, I would say, the best protection possible. Okay, another question. Understand DoD policy is to change password every 60 days. Is it acceptable to repeat passwords? Yes, it is acceptable to repeat passwords as long as the password hasn't been used within the last 24 times. DoD policy states that password history is set to 24. Oh, good. I have another good question. Did OPM adequately protect DoD personnel information in accordance with best practices? Well, I briefly touched on OPM during the webinar, and I can only report on what was in the news. I don't have any actual insight into what occurred. I would certainly hope so, though I cannot say with any absolute certainty as to what OPM's practices were. Okay, are the privileged users considered sensitive critical or non-sensitive critical? Okay, this is based on sensitive. Those are based on the position that you hold and the level of information that you are assigned to. So, and it will usually be outlined within your position description. So if you have any question about whether your position is dictated as sensitive critical, you would be able to refer to your position description. Okay, do we have any more questions that are coming in? Okay. So I don't see any more questions that are coming in at this particular time. So if there are any questions that come in after this webinar, I will be sure to answer those questions, and I will ensure that they are posted to the website. So that's all that we have for today's webinar. But before we conclude today's presentation, we hope you'll take a moment to participate in our survey. Your feedback is very helpful to us and is greatly appreciated. If you have ideas for future webinar topics, we'll be able to share those in this survey. You'll be able to share those in this survey. When the webinar is closed, the survey link should appear on your screen, so you'll have the opportunity to comment. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, our previous cybersecurity webinars have been archived and is available on our website. Shown on the screen now are a listing of some of our most recent ones. So if you didn't get a chance to listen in, please go to our website and check them out. They are available 24/7 at your convenience. Also, please be sure to check out some of our other exciting offerings, including e-learning courses, instructor-led courses, and shorts. So on behalf of all of CDSC, this is Renee saying thanks for spending your time with us. Have a great day, and remember, cybersecurity is everyone's business.
Thank you, and this does conclude today's conference. All parties may disconnect.